Could Chiefs cornerback L'Jarius Sneed be the Falcons' version of Jalen Ramsey?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. aka been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer that makes this podcast your first listen or first watch of the day. And to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcast. So today's episode, we'll talk about the Falcons' alleged interest in Tampa Bay Bucs wide receiver Mike Evans, who resigned today with the Bucs, and sort of what that tells us about the Falcons' offseason plans as well as their quarterback plans. We'll talk a little bit about whether or not AJ Terrell or trading AJ Terrell, is a possibility this offseason. And the reason that comes up is because we have a listener question from our guy AJ, who emailed this to lockedonfalcons@mail.com last week. And my bad, AJ, for not checking the inbox. But I'm glad I waited, because if I had answered this question last week, I probably would have been like, no, that doesn't matter. But now I've sat on it for a couple of days, we'll get it. But let's read AJ's question. He says, rumors are rumors, but there has been a ton of smoke on Chiefs cornerback L'Jarius Sneed. Do the Falcons prioritize a good CB2? Or is it a possibility that AJ Terrell can be traded to get into the top three? And we'll answer the AJ Terrell aspect of that question. But, Tony Pauline of Sportskeeda, formerly of Pro Football Network, has been sort of pushing the L'Jarius Sneed smoke, as AJ, suggested. AJ, the listener, not AJ, the corner. For the last couple of days, I've been hearing that and seeing that, and I've been like, no, I'm not buying it. And I kind of went into it, thinking, that was going to be the case. But I started doing a little bit of research. I love my research. And I was like, it actually makes a little bit of sense, right? Initially, I was kind of dismissive of it because it's like, okay, Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated sort of wrote his Monday morning column earlier today, sort of suggesting that, the price tag to get L'Jarius Sneed, now that he's been tagged by the Kansas City Chiefs, would be a second-round pick and $20 million a year on the contract. And that makes sense. I figured that would be his price tag from a contract standpoint. And then doing some research over the weekend about, past tags and trades, oftentimes it's a second round pick. I want to say the Chiefs gave up a second round pick for Frank Clark when he was tagged and traded by the Seahawks several years ago. So that makes sense. But I was a little skeptical because I'm like, okay, are you going to make L'Jarius Sneed one of the three highest paid corners in the NFL, which is what a $20 million contract would be, in lieu of also paying AJ Terrell something in that area? And why would you want to pay $40 million for corners? And, it's a lot of money. But the more I think about it, I was like, you know what? It would make sense if the Falcons were prioritizing the star role. And that was the role that Jalen Ramsey played with the Rams under Raheem Morris, which was that sort of role where he was an outside corner, but also would play in nickel. He would play in the box. He would play all over the secondary. And they would often ask him to line up against number ones. He would be a mismatch, a matchup sort of eraser type of guy. And while I don't think L'Jarius Sneed is on Jalen Ramsey's level, if you prioritize that specific role, L'Jarius Sneed is probably as good a bet as you're going to be able to make playing that role, other than, going out there and convincing the Dolphins to trade Jalen Ramsey. And, he plays all over the Chiefs secondary. The previous 2 years, he was a starting outside corner, but in nickel situation, he would kick inside and play in the slot, which was his main function in that defense. But this past year, he was primarily an outside corner, and he often was asked to line up and cover number ones, and he did a pretty good job doing that. And I know it was a big deal among Chiefs fans that he was a Pro Bowl snub this year, despite playing some of the best football we've seen from him. And if you value that role, I think Sneed is potentially the best bet that you can make for that type of player, right? That unless you're going to go out and use the 8th overall pick on a Terrion Arnold out of Alabama or a Cooper DeJean out of Iowa, two of the top corners in this draft class that, have similar sort of inside outside versatility, can impact as run defenders, all those various things. Both of those guys are being projected to be, potential top 15, top 20 picks, but I don't know if either one of those guys is going to be in strong consideration. We'll see as the draft cycle develops over the next 7+ weeks. But for the Falcons at 8, right? That may be their ceiling or whatever the case may be. But if you're not going to get one of those guys in round 1, unless the Falcons trade back, they're probably not going to get one of those guys. Again, I can understand why a team like Atlanta is like, what, Sneed is the best fit for that role. So, I know we talked about this, I think, when I did my positional breakdown earlier this month or earlier last month in February. I got to remember it's March now, where I talked about how the Falcons have had this revolving door opposite AJ Terrell at the CB2 spot, for the last 4 years. At AJ Terrell, there has been a different cornerback expected to be that CB2 week 1 of each year. And, the hope was that we could finally resolve that this offseason. But I think I said on that episode that since you're probably not going to get Sneed or Jalen Johnson because they're going to get tagged, you're probably going to have to punt that because those are only real 2 free agent options for that. You're probably going to have to punt that potentially to the future in free agency, and maybe you hope you hit on a draft pick, but probably not in round 1, but maybe you hit on a day 2 pick at that position and just, you'll punt that to next year. But if it does become a priority for the Falcons, again, it makes sense for the Falcons to have Sneed play that star role and also be their long-term answer at that CB2. And so that you can sort of nip both of those issues in the bud. And so the more I think about it, like the Sneed smoke makes some sense that the Falcons are willing to give up a 2nd-round pick. And again, you're probably going to get more bang for your buck using that 2nd-round pick on Sneed and paying, the high price that you need to pay for him than you would, for any other draft pick at that position outside of using, the 8th overall selection on a corner in that role. And so it does kind of match up a little bit with the Rams strategy of like, we're going to use some of these premium assets in order to get star players. And so again, I went into this thinking, as I said at the beginning, like if I had answered this question 5 days ago, when AJ had sent it, I think it was like 6 days ago, I would have said like, no, it doesn't make any sense for the Falcons to go after Sneed. And I remember doing a radio spot last week, basically saying that like, it doesn't make a ton of sense for me for the Falcons to pay both AJ Terrell and L'Jarius Sneed and also give up the asset that you would have to get for L'Jarius Sneed. But the more I think about it, it does make some sense if that's the goal of the Falcons. If they're looking for their version of Jalen Ramsey, I think L'Jarius Sneed is probably as good a bet as you're going to get because he checks mainly similar boxes that Jalen Ramsey. I don't think he's as good as Jalen Ramsey was in terms of checking those boxes. He's not, using a very flashy highlighter or whatever to check those boxes, if you get my drift. But, he's checking those in a nice pen. I don't know. This analogy is not going anywhere, but you know what I'm saying. So I think L'Jarius Sneed makes more sense. And so I'm much more open to that idea today than I would have been a week ago when those rumors first started getting floated out there. So because of, that possibility, it makes people wonder like, okay, if the Falcons are interested in Sneed, what does that mean for AJ Terrell? And as AJ, the listener, asks in his question, does that mean AJ could be on the move? And we'll break that down and why I don't think that is going to be the case, but we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and a lot of us spend our times wishing we had more time. If I had more time, I'd be grinding more draft film. But what would you do with your extra time? A better way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can do more of it. Therapy has benefited me. It's taught me coping skills. Like I can only control what I can control. I can't control whether or not the Falcons trade their number 1 quarter or go back and trade a draft pick for a number 2 corner. But if you're looking for those coping skills, if you're looking to find ways to prioritize the things that are important to you, think about giving therapy a try, right? And you should start with BetterHelp. They've been great for me. They can be great for you. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked-on. So continuing with today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, the first of its kind, right here on YouTube, giving you all the biggest stories from the national leagues and national shows. And of course, if you're looking for more local flair, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube as well. So let's talk about the possibility of the Falcons trading AJ Terrell, but and as AJ frames it, as part of a package to trade up into the top 3 to get a quarterback. Certainly, I've seen that idea floated out for months now. Late December, early January, when Falcon fans sort of had dreams of the Bears sort of keeping Justin Fields and shopping the number 1 pick. And I've said, since early January that's a pipe dream. It seems like as we get closer to the draft in the 2 months since then, that it seems to be a pipe dream. But we'll see. We'll see how that all goes. But I don't think trading up into 1 or 2 is a realistic scenario for the Falcons. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say there's a 0% chance that happens, but we're in the fractions, we're in the decimals when it comes to the chances of Chicago or Washington trading back to 8. Now, if you want to have a conversation about Chicago and Washington trading with one another, that to me seems more plausible than either one of those teams trading back to 8. But we'll see how that develops over the next 7+ weeks. But with that in mind, like I've seen, AJ Terrell, Kyle Pitts being part of potential packages for that. Now, if we're crossing 1 and 2 off the board, could AJ Terrell be part of a package to get to 3, right? And we seem to think that is probably a little bit more plausible, that New England could move out of 3, or at least New England could either move out of 3 or they could pass on a quarterback, right? Especially if they were successful in signing a quarterback in free agency or acquiring sort of that established starter in free agency. And maybe they trade out of 3 or they stick and take Marvin Harrison or whoever they deem to be the top wide receiver in this draft class, maybe Malik Neighbors, who knows. But, that's a possibility, and that opens the door for a team like the Falcons among so many other teams to potentially move up to get, the 3rd best quarterback in this draft. And so could AJ Terrell be part of that package? Sure. Technically, sure. I think that's possible. But I think the problem with that is you're just creating another hole that you have to fill. And it doesn't make a ton of sense for the Falcons to do that, right? Again, I know we all sit here and put a lot of stock and a lot of value, and we got to get the quarterback. But I don't know if it's worthwhile, especially depending on who's going to be that quarterback that you're trading up for. Because again, I think a lot of people just, and again, I'm at fault for this. We often frame it as, hey, just get into the top 3 and get one of those 3 guys. They're all good. It doesn't matter who. But as I tried to explain on a previous episode last week, that's not how NFL teams operate. Like, we on the outside can just simply say, oh, they're all, equals or whatever. But NFL teams are not going to think that. NFL teams are going to actually sit there and do the work and actually stack these players. And it's very unlikely. Again, I'm sure it's possible, and maybe 1 or 2 teams have it. But I don't think there's going to be too many teams out there in the NFL that are going to have all 3 of these quarterbacks, 1, 2, and 3 on their draft board, right? You might have some teams that have them 1 and 2, but then the 3rd guy is 13, the 3rd guy is 7, or the 3rd guy is 26, right? Or it might be 1, 5, and 15 or something, any permutation. And because of that, like, that's why I keep saying, like, we can sit here and talk all we want about, the Falcons plan A being a trade up for a quarterback, but it really depends on who's available, right? And it really, if we're assuming that Chicago's taking Caleb Williams out of USC at number 1, which, at this point seems to be the prevailing assumption. Maybe something changes over the next, 2 weeks or 7 weeks between now and the draft. The question is going to be, who's Washington going to take at 2? I think it's likely to be Drake May, but out of North Carolina, but I don't think that's, a slam dunk done deal 100%. Again, if I was betting money, I would put my money on Drake May being that number 2 pick due to his experience playing in an air raid offense that now Cliff Kingsbury is going to run a variation of under Dan Quinn in Washington. But I think there's certainly a case for Jaden Daniels to be the pick there. I certainly think the chances of Jaden Daniels being the number 2 pick went up when Dan Quinn got hired. So we'll see how that goes. But all that to say, like, I think it depends on how the Falcons stack their board. Like, again, we're often assuming that they're going to have it 1, 2, or 3 in this draft, but they may not have it. They may not be as high on Drake May. They may not be as high on Jaden Daniels. They may be, we've heard a lot of rumors over the last couple of days coming out of the combine that some teams might value JJ McCarthy over one of those top 3 guys. And again, who knows if the Falcons are one of those teams, but that's a possibility or whatever maybe the case may be. So, I say this with, in regards to AJ Terrell, like, I think we have to sort of pump the brakes a little bit, where it's just like, essentially what I'm saying, like, for me personally, again, I'm trying to explain it to you from the Falcons perspective, but I'll just give you my perspective on it. I think that's the easier way to understand it. Like, I think, Drake May and Caleb Williams are at the top of this draft class. I don't have Jaden Daniels that high. I don't have him rated that high. I'm a fan of his game. Don't get me wrong, but I don't see him as this sort of can't miss sort of prospect that it would be like, yep, trade AJ Terrell, trade this sort of linchpin piece that we have for Jaden Daniels. I don't value Jaden Daniels like that, but I know there are plenty of people out there that do. No beef with anybody who has Jaden Daniels as a QB1. That's fine. Like, I'm not here to argue with you on how you should stack your quarterback rankings. I don't frankly care. I have my opinion. You have your opinion. Let's all, have a smoke and a pancake or whatever. And whatever, I don't know, just relax about it. The constant need to argue about quarterbacks is always baffling to me. We got better things to do in the world. But for me, basically what I'm saying is, like, if we get to the draft and it's Jaden Daniels there at 3, like, again, I'm not saying I wouldn't trade up for him, although I have said that on the podcast. It depends on the package, but, like, I'm probably not going to package AJ Terrell as part of that trade, because I value AJ Terrell probably more than I value Jaden Daniels. That's just me personally. Now, the Falcons may be different, you may be different, all that and stuff. It's more. So for me, like, the problem with trading AJ Terrell is you create this hole, and how are you going to fill that hole, right? In this scenario where we're talking about it, where we've now we've used our 2nd round pick on L'Jarius Sneed, right? And now we're trading our 1st round pick. So we're not going to be able to fill it there. Right. And we talked about the price tag last week, about the price to go from 8 to 3 is probably 2 1s in a 2, right? 2 first round picks, this year's first, next year's first, and this year's second. You've already given up the second. And, next year, usually the way the draft trades work is this year's second equals next year's first, right? In terms of you move up around if you trade a future pick, right? So if you wanted to, so you can't really do that because you already packaged that. So do you give up 3 firsts? Do you give up, a 3rd and a 4th? Like, and so, like, you're not really in a position where you can, if you trade AJ Terrell, you're not really in a position to replace him, right? It would be different if it's Kyle Pitts, and I'm not suggesting that the Falcons should trade Kyle Pitts, but theoretically, you can find a quality tight end in the 3rd or 4th round, right? You can find a functional, capable starting tight end in the 3rd or 4th round. You're not going to get a Kyle Pitts level talent, but you can find a good starting caliber. You can find a guy that can catch 50, 60 passes a year, right, in the 3rd or 4th round at the tight end position. You're probably not going to find an AJ Terrell, a high caliber number 1 corner, in the 3rd or 4th round, right? So, like, for me, trading AJ Terrell, trading a lot of these Falcons players doesn't make a ton of sense to me, especially AJ Terrell, and especially when you have, he's part of your young core. Again, let's operate again under the assumption that the Falcons get L'Jarius Sneed, who's like 27. You have Jesse Bates, who's like 26, 27. AJ Terrell's similar age. He's one of the core foundational pieces you have under 30. You don't have that many guys, right? We have, in theory, hypothetically, in this reality, we'd have 3 of those guys in the secondary, but we don't have too many of those guys in the front 7. We need more of those pieces. And I don't think trading any of those guys, trading one of your handful of foundational young talents makes a ton of sense for this Falcon team, given how old they are, relatively speaking, on defense, right? That most of their best players outside of the secondary are all guys that are 30 plus years old or approaching 30. Caden Ellis, Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, etc. And so, trading out a young guy with no real path to replace him doesn't make a ton of sense. Are you going to go out there and overpay for another free agent to be your CB2 after you trade for AJ? So for me, all that to say, AJ, the listener, like, I'm not really buying the idea of the Falcons moving off of AJ Terrell. Again, is it in the realm of possibility? Sure. We live in a world, in a universe that has alternate realities, an infinite number of alternate realities. And maybe in one of those, it makes sense for the Falcons to package AJ Terrell in order to go up to get a quarterback. But I'm hoping personally, again, this is my 2 cents, I hope we're not living in that reality. So we'll leave that conversation aside and continue the conversation about, how aggressive the Falcons may be this offseason, given, some rumors that they were in on Mike Evans, who re-signed with the Tampa Bay Bucks today. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Football season is over, but basketball season is going strong, and that means you can get buckets at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins, and you can bet on NBA. Now that it is March, it is NCAA tournament time. Quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, so much more. If you want to bet on the NFL draft, FanDuel has got you covered. The Falcons, plus 500 for JJ McCarthy, plus 450 for Michael Penix. Or if you think, hey, Michael Penix is going to rejoin his Washington OC in Seattle, that's plus 400, 4-1 odds, basically. You put $20 down, you get $80 if you do that. Or, maybe you think the Falcons might go out there and draft a young quarterback like Bo Nix, 10-1 odds to get Bo Nix. So, you can also bet on whether or not the Bears are going to do the thing that I don't think they're going to do and trade out of that. It's all available at FanDuel. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel is an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, let's talk about Mike Evans re-signing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And this is unfortunate. This is a sad day here in the city of Atlanta because Mike Evans will continue to be a thorn in the Falcons side for probably another 2 years since he signed a 2-year contract. And he has, created problems didn't matter who the Falcons had at cornerback, Desmond Trufant, Robert Alford, AJ Terrell. He's been a problem for all of them. Maybe L'Jarius Sneed will solve the problem finally. Who knows? We'll have to sort of see on that front. But it's notable because, in addition to having to deal with that monstrosity of a human being for the next 2 years, Diana Rossini of The Athletic mentioned the Falcons among 8 teams that were, quote unquote, hoping to land Mike Evans in free agency had he made it that far. And so my first thought is like, oh, that lends credence to the idea that the Falcons are probably going to go after Kirk Cousins, but maybe it's also lends credence to the idea that the Falcons were, looking at Baker Mayfield as a plan B, plan C in terms of free agents options there, just because of the connection that Baker Mayfield had with Mike Evans this past year. And I also, in doing research over the weekend, I noted that, we know the coaching connection that Baker Mayfield has with Zach Robinson from their shared days in Los Angeles for those 5 weeks that Baker Mayfield, played for the Rams. But I also did some research and found out that Ken Zampese, who the Falcons hired as their senior offensive assistant, who's the former OC of the Cincinnati Bengals from 6-7 years ago, was also, after he left Cincinnati in 2017, I forgot that he was the quarterbacks coach for the Browns in Baker Mayfield's rookie season. So there's another connection towards Baker Mayfield. So fueling the fire that, Baker Mayfield might be the fallback plan in the event that the Falcons get either outbid for Kirk Cousins or he doesn't make it to free agency. So, but speaking of Mike Evans, and, I thought about this, I've seen people mention, oh, the Falcons could go after Mike Evans, but I never really gave it real thought until Friday when I was tweeting about Mike Evans, hopefully leaving the NFC South and going ring chasing somewhere else so that we don't have to deal with him. Although I think I mentioned the Chiefs, and then I realized now that we would play him again if he had signed with the Chiefs. So yeah, that was a bad take. But in response to that tweet that I sent out about hoping Mike Evans would leave the NFC South, my girl Tanitra Batiste of Locked On Sports Atlanta talked about him making the trip up I-75 to Atlanta. And it got me thinking about that. And for those of you that are international listeners, or at least, not geographically inclined, I-75 is the highway that connects Tampa to Atlanta. And I think also goes all the way to Detroit and whatnot. But it got me actually starting thinking about, okay, like, if the Falcons go after Mike Evans, that would make sense if they were, pursuing Kirk Cousins, right? Because it would sort of signify that they're trying to go all in, right? They're trying to maximize this potentially 2 or 3 year window that they would potentially have with Kirk Cousins and Mike Evans alongside guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. You're not expecting these guys to play 5 years. You're trying to get the most out of these guys for the next 2 or 3 years. And it just got me thinking about like how aggressive are the Falcons going to be to build a competitive team, especially in the world where they're interested in the Kirk Cousins, they're interested in a Mike Evans, they're interested in a L'Jarius Sneed. That L'Jarius Sneed, although you can trade for L'Jarius Sneed and think that he could probably play 4 or 5 years here in Atlanta, that is in a very aggressive move for the Falcons to sort of do that rather than sort of just punting that decision as I've sort of been operating till future or whatever. And so, you know, it's made me wonder. We've heard the Falcons use the term aggressive. We're going to be aggressive. And I've sort of assumed all along the Falcons would be proactive, but I've never really thought about the Falcons being aggressive and trying to, build a true contending team this offseason. And it got me thinking because, I happen to think that the Falcons are like, and I say this not to be an exact number, but I tend to think of the Falcons like they're probably like 8 pieces away from being a true contender, right? And some of those pieces are getting the quarterback, getting another playmaker at the wide receiver position, and obviously, Kirk Cousins, Baker Mayfield, trading up in the draft, whoever you think the quarterback answer is going to be. But Mike Evans could have potentially been one of those pieces to make this team, really push them over the top. But it's got me thinking, like, I don't think you can get all 8 of those pieces in one offseason, but could you realistically get like 4 of them this year and really push this team to being a true blue, the front runner in the NFC South? And then, leaving those last 4 and hopefully figuring it out next year where, you would have in that theory, a fully healthy Kirk Cousins. You're not, a year removed from the Achilles. So you're getting probably the better version of Kirk Cousins. Now that he's had a year in the system, he's been a year removed of the Achilles and whatnot. And you've sort of worked out all the kinks or whatever on your offense to hopefully put your best foot forward in 2025, as well as, potentially on the defensive side of the ball. And it's just got me thinking, how aggressive are the Falcons going to be, when we get to the outside of free agent? Again, I've assumed that they'll be proactive. They'll go out. We'll see them sign a bunch of guys, but I didn't know if they would be making too many big splashes. Like I figured Kirk Cousins would be their big splash, but now I'm entertaining the idea that, L'Jarius Sneed might be also a splash for them as well. So it's going to be a fascinating week, right? We're, a week plus away from that. The tampering period starts a week from now. And then the league year starts, 2 days after that on next Wednesday. So, it's got the wheel spinning. It's basically what I'm sitting here saying is like, we need to start thinking about, potential options for the Falcons. And I need to start opening my mind to them being a lot more aggressive in free agency, given some of these rumors this go around. And that will be fascinating to sort of see that, I'm sort of assuming that the Falcons, okay, they'll shoot to be, to win the NFC South, but, maybe the Falcons are taking it from the approach of like, no, there's a chance, like the NFC, Philadelphia is on the downward swing, right? San Francisco's probably only going to really be able to hold that sort of ship together for another year or two before they are forced to have to sell off some of those parts or whatever and start paying guys like Brock Purdy and Brandon Ayuk and whatnot. Detroit, who knows where they're going to be if and when Ben Johnson departs, in 2025. So I can see the Falcons, the wheels spinning for the Falcons if they want to be aggressive and they want to make a push to be a champion, to be that team that can make that push, that can leapfrog a team like Green Bay or whoever you think is the other sort of up and coming team in the NFC. I can see the Falcons, potentially trying to make that push. So again, it's all fascinating. We'll all see what happens in the next, 10 days or whatever. But now the wheels are spinning. Now, last little tidbit is officially before I jumped on here, the Broncos informed Russell Wilson that they will be cutting him. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago about, he's likely to be designated as a post June 1 cut, and cut this offseason. We'll see, if Russell Wilson is part of the Falcons' plans to, make that push or whatever. I don't expect him to be a front runner for the Falcons. I'm sure maybe they'll sniff around. Who knows? We'll see how that goes. But worth mentioning here at the end of the episode. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Appreciate all you guys for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with Jordan Rodriguez of The Athletic to talk more about the Rams, what Raheem Morris and Zach Robinson are bringing to the table, and maybe she'll have some insights into maybe some of the directions that they might go from a personnel standpoint based off of what those guys did in LA for the last few years. So that is in store for you as your first listen. Continue to check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today, Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.